to have no friends in a society where family doesn't do anything for you and you don't know, you're not really interacting with them much. They're not very useful, as I point out. I mean, in terms of your career, finding a mate. I mean, they don't play those roles anymore. You know, we kind of do need friends more now in this kind of society because the friends are the replacement for your family in a traditional society. I mean, it's so obvious. It's right in front of us. So we can definitely argue whether you need 50 or 20 or 10, but my gosh, you need something to replace the complete vacuum of the extended family, which in traditional societies was the primary place that you got everything dealt with.
James F. Richardson, author of Our Worst Strength, is renowned for exploring the duality of human nature. Born in the Midwest, his early exposure to resilience and community shaped his writing. A former teacher and counselor, Richardson brings authenticity to his multidimensional characters and gripping narratives. Our Worst Strength examines how strengths can become vulnerabilities, resonating deeply with readers. An advocate for mental health, he uses storytelling to inspire empathy connection.
James, welcome to Discover More.
Thanks for having me, Benoit. It'll be fun.
It will be fun. So why do sociopaths thrive in American workplace?
Well, I think the ability to shut down, empathy and essentially manipulate colleagues for your own self-aggrandizement at work. If you can do that almost innately, as opposed to as an act, but if that's how you live your life anyways, then you have a lot of stamina for manipulating people at work. And the reality is that our workplace in the United States, because we rely on promotions, this thing called a promotion to get your wages up way ahead of inflation. And a lot of people aren't aware of this, but there aren't a lot of businesses that just give what we would call tenure-based raises above inflation. Like, hey, you've been a great performer for the last couple of years, so we're going to give you a 15% raise without a promotion and without asking you to do any more. That rarely happens in American business. And so people are encouraged to behave, which is what I talk about in the book, behave like sociopaths at work, which is how can I create a project? How can I insert myself in a high visibility project and then wrangle a whole bunch of people to sacrifice time for me on this project so that I can be the hero and then I get my promotion. This is basically a daily occurrence in corporate America. And it's very easy to narrate it to your colleagues as, well, I'm just a leader. I'm just a good project leader, right? Meanwhile, what could be going on in the scenes is a lot of bullying, a lot of abusive BS from people that person has targeted to be manipulable, right? In other words, they're not going to fight back. And ironically, Benoit, I can't prove this, but ironically, I feel it's gotten worse with women in the workplace because they're just an easier target, especially for men.
So are you saying that promotion is often predicated on self-promotion and being able to talk about ourselves over just pure merits and performance and competency?
And sort of taking credit for group efforts to me, it's a classic form of American social manipulation, right? So clinically, this is not necessarily sociopathic behavior, but it becomes faux sociopathy in a way because you could care less what other people think that helped you. Because the system isn't rewarding you to care about them, right? If you're running projects and managing your resume to get a promotion, you're automatically not in mentor mode, which is a mode of giving, right? The two things don't really coexist well. And I've seen it up close in companies I've worked in. And as long as management is happy with your outcome, it's amazing especially in small businesses that aren't well managed, it's amazing how much sociopathic and just really antisocial behavior will be condoned because there's some productive outcome. I mean, I worked at a company where this very disturbed person was producing talking points for the CEO for sales. And because they worked, he didn't care what he did in the office. And he drove everyone nuts.
I think, James, that reminds me of a very well-known saying in American corporate world. People do not leave their jobs for jobs. They leave their jobs because of their managers and bosses.
Yeah, well, that's why I left my last job. I mean, I actually left jobs. I mean, I don't know how else to put it, but I have been struggling with adapting my Asperger's brain to the chaos of corporate America for many years. And I just realized that, there was a point when I realized I personally was going to be happier in an environment where I didn't have colleagues, Benoit, because my brain is one that neurologically, it doesn't do well with much stress at all. Ask my wife. And so the best way for me to operate in daily life is to architect some universe where there's minimal social interaction, not a lot of stress. And corporate America is unbelievably stressful psychologically. You have collegial stress, it's coming vertically and horizontally. Then in a professional service environment, which is how I make money, you got clients, right? So for me, that was just too much. It took me a long time to get that mature. Like, I should just work for myself.
We may or may not go into your reasons for departing academia, speaking of toxic stress at work. And as you and I know, academia is the graveyard where a lot of dreams go to die because of tremendous ego, to say the least. But can you first share what is Asperger's syndrome? Because there's a lot of misinformation. So what is that? And how did that allow you to peep behind the curtain of this hidden individualism in America?
So being a clinician, this is my best definition, mode of neurodivergence in which adult has problems reading social cues in the moment and has a problem filtering themselves. They tend to be too honest. They tend to lack the ability to tell white social lies in complex social situations, which is pretty necessary. And for me, it presents as sometimes I just get, and there's a lot of obsessive focus on things that Aspie person's interested in. And that could be a conversation they're having. So like I rant a lot. Though you're not going to let me do it today. I rant a lot. I obsess and fixate, and that could be, it's often in a conversation. So I'm really bad at parties because I won't shut up. Like if I find someone who's interesting to talk to, I lock onto them like with claws. And that drives people nuts. So it also in complex workplaces, people like me, we don't deal with social ambiguity well. That's probably the most important thing. And it connects directly to my book because in a hyper-individualist society, which wants everyone to be super adaptive, super flexible, always changing, always improving, everything's ambiguous. My brain was built for like an Amish world. And I probably, I might stick out there a little bit, but not nearly as much because there would be so little stress, right? So, but when you put a lot of social stress on someone like me, then there will be the meltdown is what they call it, right?
Mm-hmm. Can you contextualize a little bit further what social ambiguity is specific to in a social context?
Not knowing in a conversation whether the person is really on your side or not, because we're so good at smoke screening, fake friendship, and blah, especially in business, to like keep you as a potential ally, right? But we may actually not like you. So not knowing where you stand with people, I think is an epidemic in modern America. It's a country of fake smiles, fake stranger friendship. Who knows what it means? And I just my brain doesn't know what to do with that. It makes me unsettled. Right. Even in the American workplace, unless you're in top 10% of companies, you're probably going to experience that. I don't know where I fit. I don't know where I stand. Right. A lot of people are annoyed by that, but people with my brain, it literally sends us into panic mode. And that can be resolved by just coming home exhausted every Friday or having full-blown panic attacks, which I have had.
I want to quickly highlight 3 different words. Speaking of, like you said, superficiality and the social ambiguity, since we all are good at putting different masks, smiling, like you talked about in the book, laughing outrageously, even for very mild and non-funny jokes, for the sake of this business relationship maintenance or whatever you want to call it. I'm thinking about 3 words you just hit me: conversation, dialogue, and discourse. I think those are 3 tiers, and I think people get them confused. I think a lot of people pride themselves for being like a high-touch society. I'm very high-touch, aka I'm very in-person. I love in-person conversations. But like you said, James, I think most people, even without awareness, they do a lot of drive-by or drop-in conversations on the fly, in the hallway, quick nods, small talk, sports, how's the weather, how's your family? Oh, remember the conference last year, which you also alluded to in the book? But then there's dialogue, which is more in depth, and there's discourse, which is what the podcast is about. I think that's the highest level. But why do you think this is an important distinction to make?
Well, I think the key is that in dialogue, you actually have to have empathy for the person you're talking with, because you're switching between listening and then responding. And in a culture like ours, which again, it emphasizes individual sort of pathing in your career and in your social life, right? So that you're architecting your own social network of advantage for yourself and pleasure. We've become, I think, less good at the pausing and listening, right? Which is essential to strong relationship building. And I just happen to be neurologically, like, this is what's ironic about the book, is that my brain was built for hyper individualism, because I can function on my own, Benoit, dude. I can like literally sit in this office for hours. Just, I don't need to, I don't care if I don't talk to anyone all day till my kids come home. I was built for it in a way, and yet not built for it in another way, which is, I don't even know when I've gone too far. Even a person who can function on their own, they suffer, and I did in my 20s, they suffer the damages of being disconnected, not having strong relationships. People like me are just very slow to recognize that, usually in a very bad sort of crash and burn depression situation. And that's happened to me. So I think, yeah, that's the distinction. Is small talk is nice because it sort of identifies that you're a member of the group, right? You're acknowledging that the colleagues, we're part of the tribe here at work, but it doesn't actually create a relationship. It's sort of like flashing a badge.
You said that you can thrive in hyper-individualistic setting because, like you said, your brain is wired in a certain way. And I'm thinking about the difference between being alone and feeling lonely. Aloneness and loneliness are fundamentally different. I'm extremely content at being alone. I enjoy aloneness. I'm very extroverted. At the same time, I'm comfortable being with myself and my thoughts. I've done a lot of work and a lot of cultivated practices. For you, with your Asperger's syndrome, you're saying that even though you're slow to recognize loneliness, but social isolation and lack of connection still impacts you?
It does, because that's the misunderstanding with people who are like me, is that because we're recognized by the social faux pas we commit. We're rude, we say inappropriate things, and so we're recognized for the negative stuff, right? And so it seems like we're just basically a-holes sometimes. We get confused for that. And often it's stress related in a social inappropriateness that's coming out. And we can manage that. We can work on that problem. And we're not folks who are unable to love or unable to feel. We just don't we don't bond as intensely as other people, and that causes problems in relationships. Yes. But it's not like we don't have those impulses. We're not. And that's what distinguishes like me from a true like clinical psychopath, as far as I understand the definition, is that they really have no desire to bond with anybody.
Mm-hmm.
I do.
Very, very different. Very,
yeah,
very different.
I do. I'm just not very good at it. So it's like a form of incompetence in modern day life, right? And I think what's interesting is if you go back in time, or you go back to or across the world to other societies, social structures, there isn't as much burden for the individual to be that competent, right? Because they can be in a structured setting where very little's asked of them, Benoit. On a family farm before the Civil War, you were asked to do labor. The labor was the same. Every year is the same set of labor tasks. It's not that I don't have to be that skilled to get along with my family. But you compare that to, I'm now onboarding a client, know nothing about them. They've paid me a bunch of money up front. There's a stress of delivering good, deliverable for them. Don't really know who they are. I have no idea how they're going to react. So I get stressed out every time I onboard a client. I've just learned how to manage it, right? But in another era, I would have just been, just a farm guy.
Mhm.
It's just not that complicated.
I want to zoom into this because this is pretty important. In the book, you talked about over 51% of Americans, they rely on their partners and spouses for interpersonal issues and crises. But then you also talked about 12% of Americans don't even have a friend.
Yeah.
And I think the definition of the word friend has loosened a lot, just like the word of love has been diluted exponentially in the past decades. I bring this in because I had a conversation with a Christian philosopher last year. And he was talking about this false notion and this fixation and this fallacy, or this, I guess, this heightened pressure to maintain endless amount of friends. You have your best friends, you have your good friends, you have your close friends, you have your acquaintances. And this implicit, this implied pressure of, oh my goodness, I need to have a bunch of best friends and bunch of good friends amidst paying for bills, working full-time jobs, having family situations, trauma, societal issues. I have to devote all these time to maintain interpersonal bubbles. And he told me that, but Benoit, Jesus, because he's a Christian philosopher and so am I, Jesus only had 12 disciples. Whether you believe he's deity or not, we know he was a historical figure. But if Jesus had 12 disciples and his parents, but 12 people were the closest to his life, Jesus, why do we feel this pressure of maintaining all these extensive network? And I think it's going back to your point. There's so much implied, non-explicit pressures we all live with, and we forget that.
Yeah, I do think that some of the research on some of the discussion on friendship issues may be overstating the case of the problem a little bit in terms of scale, but I don't think it's overstating the case in terms of the quality of the relationships. And the data is not perfect. I looked at most of it for my book, but I think the 12% have no friends at all. I think to me, that's the real, it's obviously not everybody, but it's just so weird. And the reason it's weird, Benoit, is and they tend to be older if you look inside the data set. So, we're not talking about high schoolers per se, but to have no friends in a society where family doesn't do anything for you and you don't know, you're not really interacting with them much. They're not very useful, as I point out. I mean, in terms of your career, finding a mate. I mean, they don't play those roles anymore. We kind of do need friends more now in this kind of society because the friends are the replacement for your family in a traditional society. I mean, it's so obvious. It's right in front of us. So we can definitely argue whether you need 50 or 20 or 10, but my gosh, you need something to replace the complete vacuum of the extended family, which in traditional societies was the primary place that you got everything dealt with. I'm a classic Anglo-Saxon case of that, where I never really knew my aunts and uncles, which is aunts and uncles in most societies are a classic place to get parental age sort of mentoring without the conflict of interest of the parent. It's an iconic place. I had no access to them. So I think we need friends. I think we need more high quality friendships more now than 100 years ago. Absolutely. And the irony is people had both back then.
And that's my undertone too.
Yeah.
Where Jesus' 12 disciples are fewer in quantity in terms of metrics, but they're highest of quality. So I agree with it. It is the quality, not the necessarily quantity.
Yeah. And I think we're bad at both. And I definitely think it's our consumer culture and media that encourage us to just sort of collapse on the couch and not make the effort. It's an insidious force in a way. And I'm really exposed to that force because it takes me a lot more effort, sort of emotionally reach out. It's so much easier my brain just wants to hide. Which is, again, this whole issue of how do you live in a society which is putting the onus on you basically for every interaction to keep it going and sustaining it versus having an actual structure that does most of that work, right? Like school, right? The time when we experience that is high school. It's so easy to make friends because you have a structure to your day. The regimentation and the mandatory arrival of everybody is actually the key thing. But once you get out of college, Benoit, what is mandatory in American social life other than you showed up enough so you can get the paycheck?
My favorite conversation is when my brain is split to 14 different directions, which is exactly now. I want to pick one of the directions and go into it. You just alluded just now. We feel like we're responsible for everything in our lives. Again, it's a tremendous psychological toll people don't think about. I want to share one of my favorite passages from a book. And I want to stay in this topic for a little bit because I think it's a very, very meaningful topic. A proud urban culture of self-help almost requires that we solve our own problems alone. Eventually, you come to believe that you caused most of the problems in your life, which, as with your successes in life, is an absurd illusion I hope to burst open in this book. One of my biggest pet peeves is the saying of self-made. Because even on a molecular level, nobody's self-made literally. Because if you want to go real dark into the social sciences that we talked about before recording, think about genetic selections and fine-tuning of individuals with highly sought-after socioeconomic class like yourself. And even in the book, you talked about PhD is now a elite hallmark of pursuit, right? Because obviously academia has diluted and been tainted and shifted over time.
Yeah.
But like really extrapolate this. The 1%er we talk about very loosely, they're 1%ers because genetically they're also 1% from the generations before them. It's literally a genetic selection process. So even if you say you don't have, let's say you're not a trust fund baby. I think people are like, oh, you're not self-made if you're a trust fund baby. Well, even if you're not a trust fund person, you're still not self-made. Because all the decisions and the sequences of events that happened by your parents, your grandparents, ancestors, genetically modify you to a degree that allows you to have certain hardware intellectually or emotionally.
Right. It's the fundamental neurological luck that you bring from birth. And I used to argue with my dad all the time, but he agrees with me now. But when I was younger, I was just like, Dad, you're like the epitome of you're both the Horatio Alger epitome, the great American dream story, but you were so lucky because you get this critical help at critical moments in his life. So he grew up in a working class, lower middle class, not poor, but lower middle class carpenter's family and didn't have a lot of money. Money was sporadic, but he got gerrymandered into a school district where Dartmouth College professors sent their kid. It's just accident of geography. Mm-hmm. Right? Then he gets put into basically an upper middle class public high school with fantastic teachers. And so he was the valedictorian. So the little poor kid, the carpenter's son, is basically, the smartest kid in the room.
Yep. And the Harvard Law, right, attorney for 30 plus years.
Yeah. And but he had high school counselors who were the ones who got him to apply to Harvard. He didn't come up with that idea. He was a classic working class person who wasn't thinking highly enough of himself. Right. So those are very small. It didn't take a lot of time for that intervention. Like, you need to apply to Ivy League schools. You're crazy. Very small intervention totally changed his life. Not everyone gets that. In fact, most kids like him, they just get treated like garbage by the teachers. Mm-hmm. Or ignored. Right now, I think, and the high raw intelligence was what allowed him to get treated differently. But he didn't control that, like you said. So this converging luck, social interaction, and then also, like you said, just genetic gifts allow some people to do really well in this society, right? Just really well. And I would add, to the extent my dad has my own neurological traits, right? Which I certainly think he has some of them. What better thing to have? What better trait to have than high functioning autism if you have to abandon your family, abandon your local community, and go off and seek your glory? It's a perfect neurological trait to have because you're not going to even worry about it. It's very ironic. It's like they said, it's selecting for neurodivergent people who aren't, because a neurotypical person, including in the working class today, Benoit, doesn't want to leave their community or their friends and family. They really don't want to do that just to make money. Neurotypical people don't want to just do that. It's just weird. But see, that will inhibit their ability to succeed economically, like in a small town. abandoning your family community is necessary. Just that alone is so bizarre. And that started in industrial societies in England in the 18th century and then spread to the US. And now that behavior of abandoning the family, it's everywhere in the world. It's in India. It's in rural India. But it doesn't select for normal people.
I want to, speaking of normal people and the radical shift in our landscape from urban, rural, small towns to now this in this post-industrialized era. In your book, you talked about Ben Franklin's, our founding father. Ben Franklin's notion of individualism was not merely as radical as what exists today in America. Even he might be a little bit lost. How so?
I think the idea that marriage is optional would probably even blow his brain. Because we know he had marital infidelity issues and other things. At least we believe so when he was in France. So we know the guy was in some ways a typical male. But he did the marriage and kids thing like everyone else. He was eccentric. In today's society, I think Ben Franklin would be as likely to never marry and just sort of mess around and just focus on his science. Because he was so busy back in the 18th century. But, I would bet he didn't even see that as a choice in life. Just like most of his peers. That's my guess. And I talk about this issue. When you create a society with this much lifestyle autonomy, you're constantly bumping into people, Benoit, who just don't perceive choice options the same way. This makes dialogue difficult with strangers, right? It's so easy to step on a landmine. And I'm particularly good at it because of my brains. So I have to be super careful. When I go out, I literally have a mental checklist. Okay, don't talk about this. Don't do this. Don't say that. Because it doesn't come naturally. And so, but it's hard because we don't know what the lifestyle assumptions are of some stranger that we're meeting. And you better not make a lot of assumptions because you have no idea. I think Ben would be bewildered by that. I'm not saying he would be offended by it. I just think he would be like, wow, this is bizarre. Because in his era, take this with a grain of salt, but in his era, that kind of eccentric, highly autonomous personal lifestyle variation, that was really honestly relegated to the aristocracy. It wasn't something you would just go and see in the average town, in their average family. I think for him to witness a whole mass society that's essentially behaving like spoiled aristocrats, which is one crass way to describe America, would very much be an odd thing for him.
Mm-hmm. No, and I want to tie that into another ethos and your brand hallmark. We are fractional humans at work. Tying into what you just said, what does this exactly mean? And how does this actually contribute to everything we've been alluding to? The increased social isolation, the loneliness, not stepping on landmines, not knowing anything about each other at work, because most of us spend at least 40 hours at work, which is a significant amount of our lifetime. And we only see what we see, but we live under this illusion that we know them better than we think we do.
Yeah, I think a lot of us have been through this experience of having worked with someone maybe for 5, 7, 8 years, worked with them, meaning you may have spent hours and hours in meetings, dialogue, doing collaborative work together, but then they will suddenly reveal something about their personal life and you'll realize, I don't know anything about this person. I mean, they might as well just have joined. And, in America, it's the sad outcome of our extreme belief in individual privacy and also a fear that the workplace can use personal details against us, which I know I have felt that concern and hid things from my colleagues deliberately, because I felt my income was on the line. And so I know what it feels like to defend that curtain of privacy around yourself. But I also know what's lost when you can't tell your colleagues that you have Asperger's so that they can work with you collaboratively on, managing my mouth and also not overreacting to things that aren't intentional. Right? But I can't have that conversation with a colleague unless I'm going to be really open about a neurological diagnosis. And what do I know? How do I know I'm not going to be mostly harmed by that? You don't. I mean, and you really don't if there's no high trust relationship with your boss. So I think we're fractional because we defend so much of our personal life is not shared with so many of our colleagues. Even the most important things, like I just mentioned, like that should be shared, right? I mean, it's just like, it's going to affect every interaction. But even something more mundane, like like us, like I talk about my book, this nurse whose sister, in about 2 years, goes from a principal to a dead drug addict in a park. I mean, that that is going to have an explosive consequence emotionally for the relatives, right? Some of them are going to just get depressed, and in her case, she just gets super freaking angry and belligerent, and no one was there saying you need to be in therapy stat, right? Nobody was saying, the community wasn't coming in and pressuring her to get a solution and get on that. People will implode at work because they are not able to share issues that are going on at home that have to be shared so that you can function at work. I mean, these are not actually separated things. That's the sad tragedy I see in America. In India, it's funny. I didn't do deep dive in workplace, like careers with people that I did research with. I didn't go into their career very much, but I did live there, and I did overhear lots of conversations about work. And this was in the late 90s, but I heard people complaining about their boss or something, basic stuff, but I didn't hear complaining about work-life balance or I work too much, because Indians don't. Urban Indians, they just clock out. Oop, it's 4:45. They start packing up. They leave, and they turn it off emotionally. They don't bother. That's what I observed, was that they had a healthier relationship to work because family was actually their primary identity. That was super clear in the community I was in. The love and support of their family was why they woke up in the morning. The job was just something, that made that possible. So the fractional part is that we are unknowable because of this privacy issue we have, and that privacy issue is actually, it's part of how we remain flexible and adaptable, is that we remain hidden, right? So I can, like, if I were to go and blow up if I were to completely destroy my reputation at one office, I get laid off, I get fired. I'm just making this up. I get fired. I can completely hide that. I can move cities, and I'm literally, it's like the witness protection program for free. I just start over. It's just like, and that's actually a great thing about America in some cases. Like if you're escaping abuse, but if you are actually just running from personal problems, they will just go for on and on and on, because there will be because of the wall of privacy, you will never be discovered. You'll just get spat out. And I've seen these occurrences at work where people are coming in, they're getting fired in 3 months. And the society is not going to pressure them no employer cares about healing them. They just want them at the door. So that's another case where privacy causes an inability for individuals to heal, because the workplace is where the bad behavior happens in some cases. But then it just gets all buried under the rug, right? Because a workplace doesn't have it doesn't have a public health responsibility, right? We don't look at it that way. There's no community responsibility. But work is actually where most people break down, I think, when their life is out of control. That's where you're going to see it.
And I think wall of privacy is also attributable to this lack of psychological safety net that you alluded to, or undertone of that. And of course, like chicken or the egg. Which one came first? Is it our hyper fixations on privacy? Or is it because of lack of psychological safety net that we perceive as? Therefore, we feel the need to safeguard ourselves and be fractured at work. But I do want to zoom in onto a nurse's example.
Yeah.
And this was the first time reading your book, right? I had to put the book down and really contemplate and think about the consequences of this. And what I mean by that is, you talked about it. The default prescriptions that we give to others when they're dealing with tragedies, unfathomable tragedies, like the nurse losing her family, right? Is, give her some space. Leave her alone. She'll reach out if she needs it. Just let her be for a bit. Like, let that sink in. What we prescribe to those that are in our lives when they need the most help, when they need the most social support, when they need the most check-ins and the community support, is social isolation. Leave them be. Give them space. What do you think about that?
as an anthropologist, it's like all I can say is either Americans have discovered the magic cure for grief, or we're totally insane. Because no other society documented by anthropologists approaches grief this way. I sat in a living room, Benoit, with the dead body of a 16-year-old with a heart defect, and watched their family pile on top of each other weeping for hours. And I had never seen anyone grieve like that. That to me is a healthy reaction to premature death. Crippling, disabling, human bonding, right? I mean, they literally melted into one. Because that's a natural human response. What we have learned, some of us have learned to do, is this, and it's really bad, I have to say, in Anglo-Saxonville, to the extent that it still exists. It's really bad in families like ours, where you are expected to contain most of those negative grief emotions. I mean, you're not expected to be normal, but you're not expected to actually let it rip. And I can tell you, in most human societies that anthropologists have studied, premature death, even non-premature death, is signaled by wailing, screaming. Life shuts down for a couple of days, because the community was wounded. Right? It's like the community's leg was ripped open. And so just like if I cut your leg with a knife, you will be on the ground writhing. Your life will now temporarily stop. Your schedule gets paused. Right? That's how humans normally treat death. And they really treat premature death as a grievous wound to the community body. But in individualistic society, you're not actually that bonded to anybody, right? Very few, some very close people. It's a very small number of people where you're going to respond emotionally like a traditional society, right? So if your sexual partner dies prematurely, you will react like the Tamil family. I guarantee, even if you're an Anglo-Saxon, you will fall down and scream and yell. So it definitely happens. But in normal grief, or in grief in the workplace, you're not allowed to express that that's going on. What was so sad about her story was that they actually had an institutional process to deal with this, but her boss was so callous, he didn't bother to double check. And he didn't bother to think, oh, you need to go to employee assistance and get therapy right now. The minute she told him of the death, he should have said that. In fact, he was trained to say that. He did not.
And paid to say that.
Yeah, he did not give a shit.
Mm-hmm.
So he was just a bureaucrat. It's like, you're now an unproductive employee causing a pain in my butt. And that's the tragedy of how we deal with grief, because it's often going to present at work, because we're at work most of the day. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. It's the biggest chunk of daytime. So most of our emotional outbursts are probably going to happen there, right? If we were on a family farm before the Civil War, our emotional problems were all first displayed to the relatives on the farm. The public didn't have to deal with it. The family dealt with it.
Mm-hmm.
And we can see how there's problems with that, but on the whole, it was probably more functional because they knew you really well. And so it's high trust. They were going to, if somebody's wife dies prematurely, they're not going to sit there and scream at them to get back out on the farm and get the fields ready. It's just like, they're just not going to do that. But some impersonal manager in a bureaucracy? Yeah. So I think we talk about loneliness in the abstract, but I think this is how it presents. It presents at work when things are going badly at home, because we can't share, or we can only share with one or two people, but we have to interact with 50. That itself is weird. Like, I don't know. You've probably been in an office situation where like someone had a big personal problem and like you were the last to know. That's the symptom of this problem, because we don't know it just gets released in gossip. It doesn't get released from leadership, right? The one time I saw this handled well was when a colleague of mine, his wife, got terminal lung cancer. She went into remission and then came back. And it came back really bad. And so she had 12 months to live, and they paid for him to stay with her. So he just took care of her for the last 12 months of her life with full salary and benefits. But he'd been a loyal employee for 20 years. All right. He was close friends with the CEO. I'm not even sure they would have done that. They necessarily would have done that for a brand new employee.
Hmm. I mean, I think this is an interesting conversation because you're an anthropologist and I'm a psychotherapist. You study human behavior on a macro level and then you zoom in to see the individual impact. I'm the other way. I look at the individual human behavior and extrapolate that onto the macro to see what the trickle effect is.
Right.
I bring our professions in because my mind's going where how do we then balance the fine line between well-intention of I don't want to shift my burden onto other people.
Yeah.
I don't want to burden other people because of I'm empathetic, because of my compassion, because I know all too well that other people are also dealing with their invisible struggle. And so they feel this need, not out of lack of psychological safety net necessarily in a outside of workplace, interpersonally, but because they understand that all too well, they choose to hold that in and deal with that burden by themselves. Like, where do you see this balance in terms of reaching out and relying on a community? Because we're not expected to be normal all the time. That doesn't make sense.
No.
With these major life changing inflection points you just alluded to. So James, where do you see this balance?
I think the balance has to be struck with creating work cultures where you can be really open with your manager, almost like they're a sibling. Because if you can't create a relationship there, you're not going to get the workplace to understand your situation empathetically. And the burdening issue, I'm glad you brought that up. I do think this is I think it's a very self-defeating narrative we teach ourselves that we're burdening other people. So let me share like what the response was when I have broken down at work. I mean, like crying out of stress. The response with my female boss was that it was like a revolution in our working relationship because she finally saw me as a human being. I wasn't, and we'd had a very problematic relationship up until then because I was kind of, I was the socially awkward, inappropriate person who was always causing problems. I was causing too many client problems. I was highly productive, but I would always tick off clients. And so she had me in this problem employee box. Didn't see me as a human being. And it's very easy for people to fall into that trap without being forced to be more empathetic. And I think, breaking down in front of her, and there's a lot going on in my personal life and other stuff. And so I think it just actually opened up a pathway for her to realize, oh, wait a minute, he's not actually trying to be difficult. All the time, he's actually struggling with stuff. To me, I don't see how you lose. And she certainly didn't come. She never came to me and said, God, you stop bringing your shit to work, James. I don't want to see you bawling in front of me. It was the opposite reaction. Even the, baby boomer male who had triggered that reaction from me by being a DICK came in and apologized because he'd gone too far, and I think that was very revealing to me that the solution actually is right in front of us, but we're going to have to take the first step. And here's another way to look at it. If you're in a workplace where you can't share some temporary limitations you're going to have at work based on a personal issue going on, you need another job. You might as well find that out now so you can start looking for it, because don't stay working for those people. Do not work for people who don't care. And there are a lot of them out there. As you probably know, they're also in the nonprofit sector. It's like, that's no panacea.
Yeah. The corruption and the dysfunctions in nonprofit that could be an episode of itself.
Whenever you bring morality into the heart of the organization, that's when I get super nervous. Just like, whoa.
But I just want to piggyback on what you said, James. Harvard Business School published a study years ago saying that perceived perfection erodes trust. What that means is the best way to gain trust is vulnerability. And I'm not talking about incompetency. I'm not talking about weakness. Just willingness to display your emotions, your humanity is what builds trust. Because when you don't see other people make mistakes or break down, like you said, we have this guard up. We're like, they're not personable. They must be robots. They're too good for me. A lot of underlying psychological traits going on. But I share that because I'm a forensic clinician. I work in a core mandated setting, and I work with patients, some of them with very violent criminal backgrounds. And I don't pathologize. A lot of these patients with criminal backgrounds, they have tremendous ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, tremendous trauma growing up. And they just get re-manifested in a very violent way because it was not mitigated early on. I share that because about 8 months ago, I almost got physically attacked by one of my patients in my therapy room. He got up and he almost punched me. I had to press the emergency button to call in the security to disengage the situation. I'm also a veteran. I served in the U.S. military for 6 years in the Army. So for the week after, I think I was unknowingly repressing my emotions because I said, oh, I'm a veteran. I've seen worse. I know how to deal with this. And I was never harmed. But then I realized, hold on. I'm a psychotherapist. I'm not a veteran anymore. I should not feel for fear of safety in a private office space for therapy for the sake of my patients. I should not feel that way. That doesn't make sense. I shouldn't have had to press the emergency buttons to solicit help with the security guard. But I didn't share that with my management because I thought I could tough it out. I wasn't harmed. He didn't punch me. He came close. He was literally inches away from my face, right? But it was fine. But I realized I need to be vulnerable and share that it's not okay. And I can't work with that patient anymore. I just can't. And we were able to transfer the patient out to a different psychotherapist. But here's my point. Just like you with your female boss, it was a visible shift. I've always been close to my bosses, and they're all female because, as you know, social services is predominantly female.
Highly likely to be the case.
Right. And I felt this visible shift in our dynamic and our relationship. My their perception of who I am went from this tough guy who's articulate, who present myself in a certain way, who never reached us for help, very self-starting, all this, to, oh, Benoit is a person too. He also gets scared. He also has emotions. And it was exponentially beneficial. This is very important. That's why I wanted to project this on a messaging board.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I've done on this issue of trying to break down that privacy wall, that sort of BS of, especially in front of higher management, that, I'm this perfect employee and all this. And for decades, we were trained to do this to get promoted, and I think with more women in positions of leadership, I think it's getting easier to break down the pattern. Not with all women, but with probably the majority of them in leadership positions. They're much more likely to go through that experience that you just talked about of, oh, wow. Because with men, especially, their concern is that I am dealing with, if they don't have a connection, it's like, how do I create a connection? I don't know. And I'm and as an Asperger's person, I come off as sort of someone who's totally not interested in anybody. Like, seriously. And that really ticks people off. And I don't even have to say anything. It's just a bodily presence, right? So what I did to create a relationship with her, and this came out of therapy, you'll appreciate this, like work with my therapist, like, well, I don't understand how to create a bond with this person. And so we worked on some techniques, and one of them that I just used, every day I came to work, we arrived at the same time, I would go in and when she sat down and got settled, I would get up and I'd go in and just say, hey, how you doing? What's up? Just chitty chat. And I started learning all sorts of stuff about her personal life. And I've been working with her for 11 years. I mean, it was just so bizarre. But our relationship totally changed. Because I just went in every day. And my therapist was like, James, she doesn't know how to work with you. You need to somehow show her that you love her in the platonically. And of course, as the Anglo-Saxon male, I just, this sounded really creepy. So he's like, just go in and say hi. How you doing? And I'm like, but it sounds so fake, Simon. It's fake. It's like, no, it isn't. Not when you've done it 50 times in a row. And he was right. It's like, and it was horrible the first 2 weeks, but once she started talking about her cat and her kids, and I was like, oh, I guess it's that easy. But see, this is my autistic problem. And this is why you do small talk, right? It builds that foundation of what we would call other languages have much better words than we do. But I think a form of love is what it is, right? I would call it sibling love, right? And I realized, oh, my boss, I'll just make her into the older sister I never had. And that's actually the paradigm that worked really well.
Yeah, no, this is I want to zoom in. This is interesting. I've never shared this publicly ever on a podcast ever. First of all, I do want to preface that autism is a spectrum. Spectrum is, people are allergic to the word spectrum now, but spectrum literally just means a spectrum. It's a range.
Yeah.
Because genetic mutations, human experience is a spectrum, literally. I have some autistic traits, and so does my wife. She's a physician. We're both high functioning. And what I mean by that is my autistic traits is my fixations over routine and productivity. I've been waking up at 5 to work out in the morning for 12 years. Being consistent comes natural to me. Plus, I have these built-in practices.
Right.
But also, the biggest things that irks me is when people move my stuff away from my usual rotation. It drives me nuts. My wife did that right in the beginning. Her biggest conflict points is I'll come home and she'll move my stuff in a more air quote optimal positions. And it's reflexive. I was like, why did you do that? Now I have to waste time to look for the things I placed it intentionally. And for my wife, her autistic traits is auditory fatigue. She gets very, very fatigued by auditory and sensory input very, very easily. And I'm very extrovert. I'm very talkative. I'm so talkative that I started a podcast, right? So and she works in a hospital all day, patients, colleagues, and so on. So after a while, we created this acute way of signaling that, hey, too much sensory input. So and this is not a joke, she'll literally say, hey, Benoit, in a very cute way, my ears are bleeding. Very melodramatic way of saying that, hey, can you shut up, right? Yeah. And I will receive her and I was like, oh, okay, she's feeling audio fatigue. Let me taper it down or let me have some alone time. I bring this in because, first of all, like just to education-wise, it is a spectrum, but B, like you talked about, it's empowering because we don't have to pathologize. We can use systems and interventions and support. For you, it was therapeutic support with your therapist. For us, it's self-awareness, communications, doing our own research, and figuring out a system that works for us. Not for other people, but for us. But I just want to share this where it's not that there's no hope. Even if you're Asperger's or autistics or whatever conditions, right, psychologically, physically, you can move through it by creating systems or soliciting help. And going back to loneliness, this is why we need dialogues and this is why we need each other.
Yeah, I think even in pre-modern eras without the advanced clinical analytical skills or diagnoses or whatever, I have this pet suspicion that although, people like ourselves were managed more easily because I think less was asked of them socially in those eras anyways. And I think it was easier to hide. But the importance of what you're bringing up is that if you do have those traits, I think, as I've done with my own son, we've got to get on that early so that people are going into adulthood with more self-awareness. And this is one of the big themes in my book that occurred to me as I was writing it was, wow, to survive in the world I'm describing throughout this book, a person needs to they need to attain self-awareness really early in adulthood. Because without that, they're not going to be able to engage in the very complex social interactions of censoring and reviewing and everything else, and selective pulling back the curtain of privacy with just the right person to get help and to adapt and to just evolve with society, which is changing fast. And so I'm a huge advocate of people getting that self-awareness through whatever means necessary. But generally, I think a professional therapist is the way to do it because they're trained at running, building the relationship and asking the right questions to get you to see. I mean, you could look at it as a strengths and weaknesses, very simplistically, sort of map of who you are. And I think I wish I had that in college. I think I could have made I could have avoided a whole bunch of weird stuff that happened and made different life decisions in the kind of world that we're in. But I I was so naive. I thought that by going the academic track, I was going to be joining this protective community where the nerd would be fine. My brain thought that this was the place where nerds go. But what happened, because I'm whatever autistic, it is actually the worst place for someone like me because it's all chaos and fighting. And I think I mentioned in my book, the only way you can get a tenure track job is through ruthless, shameless self-promotional networking. No one told me that. Everyone was telling me, oh, you just need to publish some articles. That's not how you get tenure. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
There's too many people with published articles who never got a tenure track job. That's my evidence. And I had none of the skills necessary to do that. So why was I even in the program? It's like, what was the point? It was kind of doomed from the start. Anyways, I think self-awareness early, folks, in this kind of society.
And speaking of in this type of society, I want to ask you a question. And here's one of my favorite things from your book. What's the difference between social reciprocity and monetary transactions? Since this might be a foreign concept to Americans, because I think a lot of Americans are like, oh, whoa, social reciprocity, communism, socialism? No, thanks.
I never thought of that. Yeah, I guess. That's a possible, bad interpretation. So social reciprocity is this notion that you are in a long-term relationship with someone in which you have an obligation to deliver some scope of goods or time, usually just time and labor, when the other person in that relationship needs your help and asks. In other words, randomly. And that's the key thing. This is the key thing that becomes a real problem in urban America. The idea of having a friend who is now able to call you out of the blue, text you out of the blue, and say, but can you come over in an hour? I need to. I'm not going to respond well to that. Most people are. They're going to say, well, I can't do it tonight, or gosh, I'd really like to help. But the idea that they should feel obligated to drop their schedule right now, impromptu, for another human being, that's something you do for your spouse and your children, Benoit, and your living parents if you are not estranged, which is a big if. Right? But to your friends, no. Right? There are very few people that you're going to do that. If your boss tries to pressure you to do something like drop everything and go on a business trip, you'll probably do it, but you will absolutely be seething with resentment the entire time, right? Because it was they're dangling your paycheck to get you to do it. So that's a monetary fake relationship that's making you appear to engage in reciprocal behavior. It's really just exploitation. But what I talk about in the book as social reciprocity is the essence of any loving relationship, right? And it's just that we don't have a lot of relationships that are like that. If you go look at data on your average American today, we have very few people that we actually are willing to be that vulnerable, because it is a vulnerability to be open to the random request for extensive help. It's just is a big deal. And when I was in India, I saw the most amazing male friendship networks where people. Well, actually, I don't think I mentioned this in the book, but I had a close friend who injured himself on a motorcycle. He was in the hospital, and I knew he was in the hospital, and I had an American reaction, which is, oh, well, his family will take care of him. I don't want to get involved. I don't want to bother him, because if I show up, then he feels like he has to host me in his room, and he'll get stressed out. It was totally American projection. His mother called me and yelled at me. Literally, it was like, James, you get up and you get to that hospital right now. She was literally dialing his network, get to the hospital, right? Because when you're a friend, you just drop it all and you go and you hold hands and spend some time with the person, make them feel better. You don't have a schedule more important than that. And so, I got my wrist slapped and I did it and I went to the hospital. We just don't do that. I mean, I don't want you to run an experiment and get injured and go to the hospital, see how many people show up. But it's just like, it's not going to be 100 people like it was for this guy. It was like a constant parade, of relatives and friends. Even that sacrifice, I don't think a lot of people are willing to make. And I think it's It's sad in a way because it's not an issue of time. It's an issue of prioritization culturally. There's no time excuse. Which is one reason I wrote my book the way I did, Benoit, is because it shows us in the introduction where we spend our time. The second biggest chunk of time is media-based entertainment after work. So that's where absolutely all the time that used to get spent with dropping everything to help a friend or family, a lot of that has disappeared and gone into media consumption. So that's where the time is that's higher priority than our friends. We just don't want to accept that. Deep down, it's a dark truth. And all I can say is, if you're the 1 out of 1,000 people who's not following this pattern, that's amazing. Please come on the show and tell us how you do it, because I am part of this problem, which is why I wrote about it.
I interviewed Cassie Holmes, UCLA professor and expert on time, money, and happiness. She actually talks about people who deal with the highest level of time poverty, dealing with the biggest time scarcity, are the ones who actually have the best commands on their time schedule.
Yeah.
And even in my personal life, like when you talked about who are willing to drop everything on a whim and come to your rescue, outside of your parents and your kids, I had about 4 people that show up in my mind. I know without a doubt, shadow of doubt, that they'll do that for me and I'll do it for them.
That's great.
And they're not my spouse, they're just some of my best friends. I share that because people who are willing to prioritize relationship, despite their time poverty, they will show up. And it's usually the other people who deal with tremendous time abundance who look for excuses. Like in your book, you talked about, hey bro, sorry man, I can't show up tonight anymore. I'll buy you a drink the next time. And you talked about they're probably too high on their couch, which is most likely
they cannot drive to the event.
like they're literally time couch locked. But I want to segue this into another very thought-provoking section of your book, and I've never thought about this until reading your book. What is the relationship between the explosion of endlessly recreational options and this non-committal culture? Because everything you just talked about, if you distill it and boil it down, it's being non-committal.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, bro. Let me buy you dinner. Let me buy you a coffee. I'll make it up. As if I need I could afford my own coffee. I don't need you to buy me a meal. Like, I want you to show up or commit to what you say you will commit. Because I sacrificed my own scheduling to make this happen a month ago. But you're telling me the same day, 2 hours prior, that you can't make it?
Yeah, non-committal. The way that our society trains us to be non-committal is I think one of the most important things my book highlights that other sociologists are not talking about. I think they know it intuitively, but for whatever reason, it's not cool in academia. So the topic, I know there are a lot of non-cool topics in my book that aren't, which is, I did a lot of social science lit review for this book, and it was amazing the gaps I found, and this is one of them. The idea that the way we approach fun and recreation since the 1960s, since the rise of high school as a majority experience, right? And that started around World War II. That world creates this youth recreation culture, and it's anchored in this concept of the party, right? And then what's happened is that in a way, I didn't make this connection in the book. I'll make it now. That party culture, in a sense, you could argue, has bled into recreational worlds, right? So that just as you're not, you can come to the party when you want and leave the party when you want, right? It's all cool, man. You can come to the mountain biking ride or not come. You can sign up and not show up. You can come to the mountain bike ride, but say, I'm going to have to duck off the trail early because I have to go, I don't know, clean my dog's fur, whatever it is your schedule is. Or you probably won't even say what it is because, again, veil of privacy, got something personal to do. So I'm going to violate the sanctity of the group ride by leaving early. I mean, I didn't even realize that was a bad thing. And until I started to sit back and I'm like, yeah, that's kind of obnoxious. It's like, this is a group ride, A to Z. Just, can you finish it? It's like getting up in the middle of a church liturgy. I've done it 10,000 times. I don't need to see the last part. It's just like, that's not the point. The point is to push your body through this and your soul. Right? I think the party culture sort of bled into, especially with boomers and Gen X, this notion of, recreational activities are a great place to meet friends, get something I want out of it. I want this out of this thing. And because I entered it purely for my own reasons, I don't feel any strong commitment to the rules, to the timing, to the showing up, right? I did mountain biking every weekend in Seattle from March 2023 through like the end of 25, like just maniacally. It's not how I met my wife, but I did meet one of my best friends that I still have. But I did hundreds of rides. And these are like 4 and 5 and 6 hour rides in the wilderness. Followed by beer afterwards. There's a lot of clock time with some people, but I only wound up with one friend. And part of it was because he was the one friend who was willing to pull back his veil of privacy and share something about his personal life at the beer. Most of the people I talked to would basically shut all that down, and they just wanted to talk about the ride. They didn't want to get to know me. It was so bizarre. So the way we preserve non-committalness is we keep that veil of privacy, just like we have at work. We just keep it there. And as this sort of fake intimacy, because we just practically killed ourselves going up and down a mountain. So in one sense, we just went through a survival experience. You think we would be able to open up now? I realize there's a gender thing there too, but still, come on.
Mm-hmm. It just hit me now, and the hallmark I determine what a great conversation is when I walk with more questions than answers. And I know that's the call to action you had in your book, right?
Right. I
bring that in because another trope I'm thinking about since we started this conversation with a trope is, hey, don't talk about your work in your offline. Don't talk about work in your interpersonal relationships. Leave work at work. I never saw what the issue was. I was like, makes sense. Like when you're off work, everyone's busy. Everyone has a job. What is there to talk about? Talk about work at work. But right. With what you just said, it just hit me. Maybe we could be talking about work offline because you haven't talked about work in your offline interpersonal container. Mm-hmm. Talking about work with your colleagues is not the same as talking about work with actual non-fractured humans in your life. And aside from just deepening relationships, maybe we can just give each other permission to talk about what we want to talk about. And I want to bring my wife back into this since obviously all her friends are physicians. We're married, so I'll go to their events all the time, and it's like the commitment, right? A recent guest, he made a post, just a quick tangent. He made a post on Instagram, Justin. He talks about time for my paid nap time. And I was like, what do you mean paid nap time? He says, I'm about to go watch Inside Out 2 with my kids. So he doesn't want to go, but his kids want to go. So he's committed, but he's going to say he's going to take a nap while paying for the movie. In the beginning, before our engagement and marriage, since commitment levels up as it should, when we're just dating, I stopped going to her social events with her physician friends in their residency because all they talk about is work. Medicine, and more medicine, right? And I realized this is the most boring hangouts. I've gone to a lot of them. But now what I realize is maybe there's nothing wrong with that. Maybe there is a place for you to debrief about your work outside of work. And maybe that is part of social connections. I never had that thought until just now.
Yeah, I think, I do think some of the more healthy workplaces you form friendships. And so, you go out and meet people outside of work and you can process work outside of work. And I have a funny feeling that can be, if the company's really, really dysfunctional, that won't accomplish anything other than venting. But I think it can actually be a really powerful way to build trust and everything else that the company needs in complex social work. That most office work is getting very complex. It's veering towards the creative, the negotiative, all the stuff that I can't do with other people, I like to do, drives me nuts. But it's really important. Most people are not that bad at it. And so I agree with your point. I think the first battle is to get people to bond, to, feel comfortable with manager to be able to share what's going on when that needs to be done. But this idea of just hiding this horrible trauma. I mean, the community, a community cannot help unless, in our social system, a community can't help unless we pull back that veil and say, hello. We don't have a custom of our, like our family nosing in and badgering us so without that, I do think there's a leadership responsibility at the workplace for managers and stuff to be the ones who are encouraging people, and they need to model it. So, for example, like when I've seen people blur, like in a corporate environment, when I've seen people appropriately bring the personal into the workplace because they want everyone to understand what they're going through, they tend to be executives and leaders because they're safer. I mean, they're at the top. So and I get that, but we don't want to limit it to them, but they're the ones who have to make it safe for everyone else, which I think our society, it's going to take a few generations for us to get there. It could happen.
Mm-hmm. I have a few more questions to be respectful of your time. I want to, going back to, like you said, the psychological safety net, the boss establishing culture, us hiding our trauma, not because we want to, but out of this perceived necessity. You talk about in your last chapter, diagnosis of individualism, which is pretty much the summary and SparkNotes version. I don't know how many people remember SparkNotes, but why is defining individual problem as psychological ones a symptom of American individualism?
I think because, we're a cult, individualistic culture is going to assumes that the individual is the site of all solutions. I think that's the first order assumption. In other words, especially in an achievement-based individualistic culture, your success is dependent on your effort, your motivation, your preparation, it's your schooling, all these individual level things. Your LinkedIn profile is a symbolic representation of your potential. So we assume that we're the site of the solution. And because of that assumption, we easily fall into the trap that we're the source of the problem, right? Because if you think about a performance review, does a performance review really, Benoit, spend a lot of time saying, well, we noticed you were late to a lot of meetings, seem to have a timeliness issue, it's disrespectful to your colleagues, and can we put a plan together to, for you to be on time more? And of course, what may actually be going on is the person can't stick up for themselves and is doing the job of two people. Right? Now, you think they're going to admit that in a performance review that was just framed as a personal problem? No, because the whole argument has framed this as a personal problem. So you're signaling as the manager in that performance review that you're not interested in a contextual explanation. Right. And the first thing that tends to generate in workplaces when you raise that, if you do raise that, because I've seen people raise it and get slapped down, is you're just making excuses. So I don't have a problem with the discipline of psychology per se, but its tendency, it's the most popular social science, as you know, in America, in part because it looks as the individual as the site of the solution. And I'll be honest, it often is. You are kind of left to extricate yourself from a lot of these tough situations in life. Now, I believe you can get the assistance of a third-party professional, and that makes it a social process in a sense. But a lot of people have to just figure it out. So in a way, psychology is correct, but it's only correct because there's the cultural setup in which no one wants to hear the argument. that actually this is a mismanaged workplace. And there's bosses who are delegating, half of their work plus the work that the person is supposed to do because they're jerks. So this person is overwhelmed and showing up to meetings late. Right? Now, they don't have a time management problem; they have a workload problem. That requires that you back up and do a social analysis of what is going on with the employee's behavior. I think managers are getting better at this, but man, it's not where we go with our brain intuitively, which is to me is sad. Because this doesn't require a social science degree to look at a lot of this. But you do have to be willing to listen to an employee say, I'm overworked, and not think they're whining. Not immediately think they're whining. Like maybe they are. But you could at least listen. And then you could do an investigation. Like I had an employee who basically came to a review and felt like he's just being overworked per his expectations coming into the job. And so I actually went back and looked at all his time because we logged our time at that firm. And I looked at all his time, and the annual average like 42.5 hours per week on an annual basis. But 3 times during the year there were these 60-hour spike weeks. Which sounds a lot like white collar America. And I think he had just had. So I got him to open up about so is that not going to work for you? Like having an occasional kind of client, a deadline driven spike week or because that, unfortunately, I cannot sit here and honestly say that's not going to happen. But I can tell you the average over the years is going to be pretty close to 40, which it was. So I felt the situation was fine, but then I realized, I know what it was. He probably had one too many of those, and there was an issue. There's probably a personal conflict with his partner about what the hell are you working so much for? And he just was worried that he was being taken advantage of. So he never brought it up again after I explained that my intent as a manager was to not overwork the guy. Like, I'm not here to try to get two of you out of you. That's what he wanted to hear.
Isn't it amazing that the ROI that's possible when we treat each other as humans?
Yeah.
All my freelancers and contractors for my business, for the podcast, I had them for at least a year because I understand that culture creates in retention. And retention is an indication of dysfunctions or functional culture, as you know all too well. And my guys work for me for a long time because I treat them fairly.
Right.
If they have to take time off, family, hurricane seasons, if there's a national holiday, since some of them are outsourced, if they said, I said, hey, that's fine. Just communicate with me and let me know. And of course, and I treat them fairly. I don't give them double the work for the sake of, because I know how competitive and saturated freelancing market is. I don't do any of that, you know, because I want to be able to sleep at night knowing that I treated people right. But that's self-awareness. And a lot of people choose to suppress their feeling because of different reasons. But I just want to really drive this home, and I want to end today's conversation with maybe one or two last questions. But what I wanted to drive home is we really have to, like you said, have some social analysis, sit back and think about how many other exponential growth that's possible when we just do the right things on a fundamental level. Like shortcuts have its dividends, but just like index funds, the best investment strategy in life is going off the long game approach. Doing things right will yield the best outcome.
I agree. I've been trying to model that for the last 10 years and in my business too. I think one of the ironies of a hyper-individualist society fueled by consumerism is that it constantly is goading us to chase the next new thing. It's sort of like a consumer ADHD. That we just, what can I buy? What can I enjoy? What can I pursue? And that distraction, other people have written about it very eloquently, is a massive energy suck. Actually, we don't realize how much emotional energy it sucks out of us. And falling into lifestyle comparisons is another thing that's related to that. Like, is there material culture in their house somehow better than mine? What do I not have? And people fall into this. The market wants you to fall into that because then you'll probably overspend to chase people. Meanwhile, we're emotionally distracted from investing time and energy into long-term relationships, which actually become what? They become the thing that keep you psychologically stable as an individual when the shit hits the fan in your life at work or personally. So you have the sudden divorce, you have the sudden layoff. Oh, now I need all these long-term relationships. Oh, but wait, I haven't been investing in them. You know, and I honestly, when I had my lowest low in grad school, that's when I realized I had to leave academia, because I was having a mental health crisis. And I'm like, I can't pursue this career because it's so risky. I have no network. Like, this is just crazy. You know, it's more important for me to, what I think I said, you know, get a life, as Americans say, than it is to pursue this dream anymore. Like, the dream has become a nightmare, right? It's just pointless. What's most important is to get grounded. And I just wasn't. I was just some weirdo finishing this PhD, you know, it's just kind of, so, you know, I think young people listening, you know, don't wait till you're 35 to figure this out. Figure it out now, you know, and to me, the long game is investing in relationships, and deferring some gratification, you know, in your career, because it may take a while. I worry about people who are constantly quitting and trying the next thing because they think that they think that the perfect work situation is going to appear in, you know, 8 months, 12 months. And the reality is it takes years of investment for most career victories to happen. And it's really hard to remember any of this in the way our society is set up. It really is hard.
And speaking of personal agency, speaking of increasing self-awareness, I want to end the conversation with your final question, which is what you wrote down in your book as well. We are all settlers on our own personal frontiers. What does that mean, James?
We've been given the autonomy to basically pack up and move to Arizona, right? And set up our own ranch. And, you know, in the 19th century, I'm sure that was exhilarating too. But you know what? Most people didn't want to do it. Most people who are in America sitting on the East Coast going, they're insane. Right? Who are these crazy people? Now we have a culture where everybody kind of is being taught to do this. But, you know, the frontier is dangerous. The frontier is more dangerous than the John Wayne movie depicted, right? And the irony of the frontier lifestyle is that most people actually were never cut out for it. So a lot of people went there and crashed and burned. Now that's been all lost to family history. So we know the families that succeeded, we know their stories, right? But a lot of people crashed and burned. And that's because if you're going to do something that risky and that dangerous, then you need to have an incredibly tight support network. And so the frontier people that did, they were moved with their whole family, right? They didn't go off. The people who really suffered generally, the people who naively heard about cheap land in Montana and then went with their wife and their 3 kids by themselves, right? And that happened, but that wasn't, you know, most people were smarter than that. And so they moved clans that way, right? Like 4 brothers would go with their families. That's how you settle the frontier intelligently. Right? But we've got a world where, no, you can just design your own social world. I mean, you can do it half digitally now. And I think it has lulled us into the danger implicit in trying to control all that yourself. And the danger is that you aren't building strong relationships that you're going to need. You know, because the whole settler romance is really cool at the beginning when you're getting on the stagecoach. So it's all upside. Like, what could go wrong? A lot, actually. So you go do that without a lot of people who you have high trust relationships with, you're asking for trouble.
Speaking of personal agencies and speaking of being more thoughtful and soliciting the support of the community, your family, your brotherhood, anything in between. Like I said, I really enjoyed your book and your topical expertise, not just your strategic usage of cuss words in the profanity in the book, your humor. Your book was really funny. Like, I had a couple of laugh out loud moments.
Good, that's the point.
Yeah, but mostly it's about what you said in the beginning pre-call. You said that you wrote this book with the intention of writing for laymen, not for the other experts, not the types of philosophers, not for the philosophers who reside in the ivory tower, but for the public to increase our awareness and to understand that what is this paradigm, what is this system, what is the landscape of America we live in. Sure, we pride ourselves for the excellence, and we are excellent in many frontiers. At the same time, there are insidious and hidden costs to this culture we built for generations. But yeah, James, I really enjoyed your book. Thank you for your time on a Saturday and just for this unique work that you decided to share with the world. I personally enjoyed it a lot, and I hope that people who took away something actionable, and hopefully this helps increase their awareness and allows them to empower them to do something about it. Because going back to psychology, life happens outside of our control, period. At the same time, we get to choose how we want to respond to the flows of life. And that, to me, is what truly autonomy and their personal frontier means. So without further ado, where can people check you out, get your book, anything else you want to share about?
Well, my book is on Amazon, Our Worst Strength, in multiple formats. But if you want more thinking like you see in the book or in this episode, you can subscribe to my Substack, which is growing steadily, Homo Imaginari, or just type jamesrichardson.substack.com. It'll take you right there.
And of course, I'll leave all of those links in the show notes below. But before we close out, James, is there any other parting message you want to project onto the massive messaging board for the audience?
Work on self-awareness as early as you can in life.
Yeah. Being self-actualized has only upsides, very limited downsides. Yeah. Even though being too aware could have some psychological toll, yeah, living in this world of oblivion and lack of awareness. But
yeah, I think developing that awareness with a professional is probably the smartest thing to do.
Yeah. I mean, it's like you have a banker for your bank. You work with a real estate agents for real estate. Yep. You go to a professional for anything in life. So why would it be anything different for mental health and emotional being? Yeah. But James, thank you for your time today, and thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
And to all the audience, if you have made it till this end, thank you for your time. I want to ask you to share this episode with one friend. Wouldn't you want to help them to be self-actualized and also help alleviate their sense of loneliness, knowing that the struggle at workplace, the loneliness that we feel is not alone. None of us walk this path of life alone, but the society is drifting towards that place. So we need to combat this and course correct. And course correcting requires collective input. So share this with someone that you think will benefit them. It's free for you, but priceless for the podcast's growth. And as always, I hope you choose curiosity and love over fear in the next week's train of Discover More. Thank you for tuning in.